The words landed like a bullet she never heard fired. Mary Atwood stood in the middle of the Harlan County Sheriff's office, her hands trembling at her sides, the late afternoon sun cutting through the single dusty window in a blade of copper light. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather, and something she could only describe as the particular weight of a secret finally breaking open. Across the scarred wooden desk, Calvin Barnett sat with his hat in his hands, his quiet gray eyes fixed on her face with an expression she had never once seen on any man who looked at her in this town. Not pity, not suspicion, something far more dangerous than either of those things. He had said it so softly she almost thought she had imagined it. Every report I filed left your name out because I believed you from the start. The words hung in the hot, still air between them like smoke from a just-discharged rifle. Mary felt the floor tilt beneath her boots. For 9 months of whispered accusations and cold shoulders and doors closing in her face when she walked down the main street of Caldwell, Texas, she had believed herself entirely alone. She had believed that every hand in this county had turned against her, that the law itself had been the instrument of her destruction, that the badge on every chest in this building was pinned there specifically to remind her of how thoroughly she had been abandoned. And now this quiet, unassuming deputy with the careful hands and the measured voice was telling her that all this time, while she scraped and survived and refused to break, someone had been standing between her and complete ruin. Someone had been carrying her name out of the official record like a man carrying water from a burning building, quietly, repeatedly, without ever asking to be seen doing it. She opened her mouth. Closed it, the air tasted like copper. Why? She finally managed, and her voice came out so raw it frightened her. Calvin stood slowly, the way he did everything, with a deliberate gentleness that she had always interpreted as indifference, as someone who simply did not care enough to rush. She understood now, with a kind of devastating clarity, that she had been reading him completely wrong. Because the evidence was planted, he said, and I could see it from the first morning I walked through the door. The room went very quiet. Outside, someone was shouting about a lost horse, and the sound seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a world where ordinary, uncomplicated things happened to ordinary, uncomplicated people. Mary Atwood had not lived in that world for a very long time. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the desk to keep herself upright. "You need to sit down," Calvin said, "and I need to tell you everything." It had started on a Wednesday in September of 1878, which was how most disasters started in Caldwell, quietly, on an unremarkable day, with the sun doing nothing unusual and the wind behaving itself, and no sign whatsoever that the life of a woman who had already survived more than her share of catastrophe was about to be dismantled piece by careful piece. Mary Atwood had arrived in Caldwell 18 months before that September, not as a bride or a widow or a woman following a man, but as herself, which was the first thing that made the town uneasy. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, clear-eyed, and possessed of a directness of manner that people in the Texas Panhandle region tended to find either refreshing or deeply suspicious, depending on their own relationship with honesty. She had come from Austin, where she had worked as a seamstress and a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Harlan Cross, and she had saved enough money to lease a small storefront on Caldwell's Main Street and open her own seamstress and alterations shop. It was a modest ambition, and she pursued it with a fierce, patient determination that was entirely in keeping with her character. She was good with figures, better with fabric, and exceptional with people, by which she meant that she had learned, through the particular education that life administers to women who are entirely responsible for themselves, when to speak plainly and when to hold her tongue. She had no family in Caldwell. She had acquaintances who were becoming, slowly, something that might eventually be called friends. She had a good reputation and a clean conscience and a genuine love for the work she did. What she did not have, and what Caldwell had decided from the very beginning that it could not quite forgive her for not having, was a husband. There were women in Caldwell who were widows, and that was acceptable. There were women who were wives, and that was expected. There were women who were daughters still living under their fathers' roofs, and that was perfectly natural. But a single woman of 26 who had arrived in town alone, who paid her own bills and made her own decisions, and declined every invitation from every man who had presented himself at her counter with intentions that were more personal than commercial, was a category that Caldwell found genuinely troubling. She was aware of the unease she caused. She had been aware of it her entire adult life. She had made a private peace with it somewhere in her mid-20s, somewhere between Austin and the road that had eventually brought her here, and she carried that peace around inside her the way she carried her good scissors in the deep pocket of her work apron, always there, always useful, close enough to reach when she needed them. She had been in Caldwell for a year and a half when she first properly noticed Calvin Barnett. She had seen him before, of course. Caldwell was not a large town, and the sheriff's office occupied a building on the same street as her shop, and she had registered his presence the way you registered any piece of the local landscape, as background, as context, as the quiet structural element that held the scene together without demanding attention. He had been working as deputy under Sheriff Eli Graves for about a year when Mary arrived. He was 31 years old, lean and unhurried, with gray eyes that had a quality she could not initially name, but would eventually decide, was simply that they were actually looking at what they appeared to be looking at. Most people in Mary's experience looked at you while thinking about something else. Calvin Barnett had the rare and slightly unnerving habit of being genuinely present. He had come into her shop 3 times in those first 18 months. Once to commission a shirt, once to have a tear in his coat repaired, and once to ask if she had seen a man matching a particular description pass through the street that morning, which she had, and she told him so, and he thanked her and left. Each time they had spoken perhaps 30 words total. Each time she had come away from the conversation with the faint, inexplicable sensation that something important had been communicated, but she could not quite identify what. She did not think about him in any particular way. She was busy. She was building something. She did not have the time or the inclination to think about men in particular ways, and if she had been more honest with herself, she might have admitted that this was less about time and more about a certain protective distance she had learned to maintain, a distance that had its origins in a story she was not yet ready to tell anyone in Caldwell. But September 1878 arrived, and with it, the particular disaster that was Fletcher Ruane. Fletcher Ruane was the son of Douglas Ruane, who owned the largest cattle operation in Harlan County and had been the most significant financial force in Caldwell for 15 years. Fletcher was 28, handsome in the blunt, aggressive way of a man who had never been told he was wrong about anything, and he had been pursuing Mary with a persistence that had progressed from flattering to uncomfortable to something she could only describe as a dark threat wearing the costume of courtship. He had begun by sending flowers, which she thanked him for politely and did not encourage. He had progressed to appearing at her shop during business hours to talk at her while she tried to work, which she tolerated with the constrained patience she applied to all inconveniences. He had then taken to waiting outside when she closed in the evenings, which she addressed by telling him firmly and clearly that she was not interested in his company, and that she would appreciate it if he found somewhere else to be. He had laughed and told her she would come around. She did not come around. In August, Fletcher had proposed marriage. She had declined. He had taken the declination badly, which she had anticipated, and he had said several things that she filed away as warnings, which she had also anticipated, and he had left in a fury, which she considered a reasonable resolution. 2 weeks later, Douglas Ruane's cattle safe was robbed. $430 in cash and a collection of land deeds were taken from the iron safe in the ranch house office sometime on the night of August 24th. The robbery was discovered the following morning. Sheriff Eli Graves was summoned. An investigation began. On September 3rd, 8 days after the robbery, 2 deputies arrived at Mary Atwood's shop and asked her to come with them to the sheriff's office for questioning. The grounds for questioning, as Sheriff Graves explained to her with the particular brand of polite contempt that powerful men often deploy when they want to seem fair, were that 3 witnesses had come forward to say they had seen Mary near the ruined property on the evening in question, and furthermore, a brooch belonging to Mary had allegedly been found near the broken window through which the thief had reportedly entered. Mary had listened to this with the absolute stillness of someone in genuine shock. She had not been near the ruined property on the evening of August 24th. She had been in her shop until 7 in the evening, and then she had gone home to her rented rooms above the hardware store, and she had spent the evening mending a dress for Betty Carlson and reading from the Bible her mother had given her before she died, and she had gone to bed at 10 o'clock. She had not been within a mile of Douglas Ruins ranch house. The brooch was hers. She had lost it 3 weeks before the robbery. She had looked for it and not found it, and eventually concluded she had lost it somewhere on the street or dropped it in the shop. She told all of this to Sheriff Graves. She gave him Betty Carlson's name as a partial alibi for the early evening, though Betty had not been with her the whole time. She explained about the brooch. She said the witnesses were lying or mistaken, and she was not certain which. Sheriff Graves listened with his hands folded on his desk and the expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is merely waiting for the formality of the interview to conclude. He thanked her for her time. He told her not to leave town. He did not arrest her, which she supposed was the best she could say for the encounter. She walked back to her shop through the main street of Caldwell, and she felt, for the first time since arriving in this town, genuinely afraid. The fear was not only about the accusation itself. The accusation was false, and she believed, with the stubborn faith of someone who had lived an honest life, that false accusations were supposed to be something you could fight against with the truth. But walking back down that street, past the faces of people who were now watching her with the particular quality of attention that attaches to scandal, she understood for the first time the precise nature of the trap she was in. Fletcher Ruin had been publicly refused. His family was enormously powerful in this county. Her brooch had been found at the scene of a crime committed on the Ruin property, and the sheriff, as everyone in Caldwell knew, owed Douglas Ruin several significant financial favors. She went into her shop and locked the door and sat down on the floor behind the counter and let herself feel the fear for exactly 5 minutes. She had developed this practice in Austin during a difficult period, and she found it useful. You gave the fear its time, you felt it fully, and then you stood up and decided what to do next. When the 5 minutes were over, she stood up, took off her apron, put on her hat, and walked back out. She nearly collided with Calvin Barnett on the front step. He caught her by the arm to steady her reflexively and let go immediately and said, "I was hoping to speak with you, Miss Atwood, if you have a moment." He looked, she thought, almost apologetic. It was an expression she had not seen on any face associated with the sheriff's office that morning, and it startled her. "If this is more questioning," she said, "I have already said everything I have to say." "It isn't questioning," he said. "I wanted to see the brooch, the one that was found. I wanted to know if you'd be willing to describe to me where and how you normally kept it." She studied him for a moment. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which she realized was a habitual thing with him, this business of removing his hat and holding it rather than wearing it when he spoke to someone, as though he wanted to visually lower the authority the badge implied. "Why does that matter?" she asked. "Because of where on the property it was found," he said. "The window it was allegedly dropped near isn't a window anyone would use to enter that building. It's too narrow and it's on the wrong side of the house. It's also 8 feet off the ground. Anyone going through that window would need a ladder, and no ladder was reported near the house." She looked at him carefully. "You think it was placed there?" "I think it's worth asking questions about," he said, in the careful way that she was beginning to understand was not evasion but precision. She described the brooch to him. She told him she kept it in a small ceramic dish on her shop counter during working hours, and sometimes wore it on her Sunday dress. She told him she had last been certain of seeing it on a Sunday in early August, which was approximately 3 weeks before the robbery. He listened without writing anything down, which she noted. He thanked her. He left. He had not told her what he intended to do with the information, and she had not asked, because she was not yet sure whether to trust him or whether trusting him was simply a different variety of the same trap. The days that followed were some of the worst of her life. The rumor had spread through Caldwell with the speed and thoroughness that only small-town rumor can achieve, which is to say that within 48 hours of her trip to the sheriff's office, every person in town knew about the questioning and had formed an opinion, and the opinions were not kind. Business at her shop fell off sharply. Women who had been her regular customers stopped coming. The butcher served her with a curtness that bordered on rudeness. The wife of the bank manager, who had previously been one of her closest approximations of a friend, crossed the street to avoid walking past her. She kept the shop open. She worked. She held her head up and maintained what dignity she could and tried to think clearly about what options she actually had. She had no money for a lawyer. She had no family to call on. She had no connection to anyone with sufficient influence in Caldwell to counterbalance the Ruin family's power. What she had was her own clarity about what she had and had not done, and the testimony of Betty Carlson, who confirmed that Mary had been at the shop until past 6 that evening when she had stopped in to pick up her mended dress, but could say nothing about the hours after that. 3 weeks into this ordeal, she was sitting in her shop on a quiet Tuesday evening, the last light going gold through the window, when Calvin Barnett came in again. This time he sat down on the bench she kept for customers and was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had, as though he were checking something internally before he spoke. "I've been talking to people," he said. She set down her work. "What people?" "People who worked on the Ruin property," he said, "and people who knew Fletcher Ruin before you came to town." The name in his mouth, said so plainly in relation to what had happened, made her feel a sudden fierce attention. "And there's a pattern," he said, "of a particular kind. You're not the first woman who declined Fletcher Ruin's attentions and then found herself in some kind of trouble afterward." She was very still. "What kind of trouble?" He was quiet for a moment. "A woman in Abilene. A woman here in Caldwell before your time. Both times something was stolen or damaged. Both times a woman in the vicinity was blamed, and both times the incident blew over and the woman left town and Fletcher Ruin found someone else to pursue." Mary felt something cold and certain settle into her chest. "He's done this before." "I believe so," Calvin said. He looked at her steadily. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Atwood. I can't prove it yet, and the sheriff isn't inclined to look in this direction. So anything I'm doing without his knowledge and without any official sanction, and if he finds out I'm looking into it, I'll likely be out of a job." She stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He seemed to think about the question with genuine care, as though he had been expecting it and wanted to give it the full weight of a real answer. "Because you didn't do it," he said simply, "and I'm not willing to let the law be used to destroy someone who didn't do it." She did not know what to say to this. The directness of it, the absolute simplicity of it, seemed to come from a completely different moral universe than the one she had been inhabiting for the past 3 weeks. "I've been filing weekly reports about the investigation," he said. "The sheriff requires it. Your name is in none of them." She felt the first real breath she had taken in days move through her chest. "You've been leaving my name out. Every report," he said, "because the evidence against you is fabricated, and putting your name in the official record as a suspect creates a permanent record of something that isn't true." He paused. "I believed you from the first morning I walked into that office and read the file." Something shifted in the room. She was not quite sure if it was the light or something else. "That is either the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years," she said slowly, "or it's something that could get you into serious trouble." The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "I expect it might be both," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes without flinching, without the particular social discomfort that most people showed when the gaze held too long, and she thought again about that quality she had first identified in him and named as presence. The quality of actually being in the room he was in. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Tell me everything you know about Fletcher Ruin," he said. "Everything you noticed, everything he said to you. Every interaction, in as much detail as you can remember," she told him. It took the better part of an hour, and as she talked she found that she remembered more than she had thought, that the particular alertness with which she had monitored his behavior during his pursuit of her had stored details she had not consciously recognized as significant. The way he had mentioned the ranch house layout in passing, a comment he had made about her brooch, that he had noticed it and asked about it with an odd specificity. An evening when she had looked up from locking her shop and seen him on the street earlier than she would have expected, at a time when she later realized the Carlson order had been placed, giving him information about when Betty would be stopping in that evening. Calvin listened and wrote nothing down and asked only occasional quiet questions that opened the narrative rather than directing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The brooch comment is important," he said. "If he noticed it specifically and asked about it, and then it turned up at the scene 3 weeks after you lost it, that's a connection." "Can you prove he took it?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But it gives me somewhere to look." He stood to go. She stood too, and they were very briefly in close proximity, closer than they had been, and she was aware of the particular quality of the air between them, the charged and careful stillness of two people who are paying very close attention to each other and trying not to show how much. "Deputy Barnett," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "I don't have the right words for it yet, but thank you." He put his hat on. Something in his face was very quiet and very certain. "You'll have your life back," he said. "I intend to make sure of it." He left, and she stood in her shop in the fading light, and for the first time in 3 weeks she did not feel entirely alone. The investigation that Calvin was conducting in secret took shape over the following 2 months with the patient, methodical thoroughness that was entirely consistent with how he apparently did everything. He was not a man who moved quickly, but he was also not a man who moved carelessly, and the combination produced results that quicker, careless men would not have found. He tracked down the woman from Abilene. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had been a school teacher, and she had refused Fletcher Ruin's proposal of marriage in the spring of 1876, and 6 weeks later she had been accused of stealing money from the school fund. The accusation had never been formally charged, but the rumor had been enough to end her position and drive her out of Abilene. She was now living in a town called Mercer, 40 miles north, and she was willing to write down what she knew and sign her name to it. He found one of the ranch hands who had worked on the Ruin property the night of the robbery, a man named Tomas Reyes, who had been quietly dismissed the week after the robbery and had no particular loyalty to the Ruin family remaining. Tomas told Calvin, in a conversation that took place not in the sheriff's office but in the back of the feed store on a Thursday evening, that he had not seen anyone near the house that night, but that he had seen Fletcher leaving and returning late, which was unusual, and that the following morning Fletcher had been the one to suggest to his father that the brooch found near the window belonged to that seamstress woman. This was the piece that mattered most. Tomas Reyes had heard Fletcher name her before the brooch had been officially identified. Calvin brought all of this to Mary on a November evening, sitting again in her shop after hours, and laid it out methodically: the written statement from Clara Whitmore, the testimony of Tomas Reyes, the physical analysis of the window that made entry impossible without equipment not found at the scene. Mary listened with her hands folded on her work table and felt something powerful and almost painful moving through her, the specific sensation of vindication that has waited so long it arrives like grief as much as relief. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It should be," he said. "The question is Sheriff Graves." This was the problem they had both been carefully not naming. Graves had been appointed to his position through Douglas Ruing's influence and had continued in it through Douglas Ruing's ongoing financial and political support. Taking evidence that implicated Fletcher Ruing to Sheriff Graves was, functionally, the same as taking it directly to Douglas Ruing. "There's a circuit judge," Calvin said. "Judge Arthur Pembroke. He covers this district and 3 others. He's due in Caldwell in 3 weeks for the regular court session. He is not, to my knowledge, connected to Douglas Ruing in any way because he lives in Amarillo and the Ruing family's influence doesn't extend that far." Mary understood immediately. "You want to take this directly to the judge?" "Bypassing Graves entirely," Calvin confirmed, "which will end my position here the moment Graves finds out. But by that point it shouldn't matter because if Pembroke looks at what I have, the investigation gets reopened under his authority and Graves loses his ability to bury it." She looked at him. He was sitting across from her in the lamplight, and she was struck again by the particular quality of his stillness, a stillness that was not absence but its opposite, a fullness of attention that most people never managed. His hands rested on his knees and his gray eyes were on her face, and she thought, with a clarity she had been avoiding for weeks now, that she had never in her life been looked at by anyone with this quality of steady, unconditional regard. "You would give up your position for this," she said. "I would give up my position rather than be complicit in what Graves is doing," he said carefully. "There's a difference. Not much of one from where you're standing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Atwood," he said, and then stopped and started again. "Mary, can I call you that?" The shift in register, the use of her given name, landing so gently it barely made a sound, moved through her like water through dry ground. "Yes," she said. "I have to tell you something that isn't directly related to the case," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about you," he said, with the same plain directness he applied to everything, in a way that isn't entirely professional. "I want to be clear about that, because I don't want you to think that what I'm doing for you is anything other than what it is, which is something I would do for anyone in your position. But I also want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty, and I want to tell you before this is over and not after, because if I tell you after, it will look like I'm expecting something in return and I'm not." She felt the heat rise in her face. She pressed her fingertips together under the table. "That's," she said, and then took a breath, "a very careful way to tell someone you have feelings for them." Something moved across his face, a brief, unguarded warmth that was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I'm a careful person," he said. "I've noticed," she said. They looked at each other. The lamp between them threw a small circle of gold light on the table. "I don't know what to do with this right now," she said honestly. "There's a great deal happening." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just wanted you to know." She nodded slowly. He was asking for nothing. It was possibly the most remarkable thing about him. 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday in late November, Judge Arthur Pembroke arrived in Caldwell for the quarterly court session. He was a thin, precise man of 55 with a reputation for intellectual rigor and a particular impatience with legal corruption that was widely known throughout the district. Calvin had spent those 3 weeks quietly and carefully organizing everything he had gathered into a formal presentation, written in the clean, plain language of official documentation. He presented it to Judge Pembroke on the first morning of the court session, before any of the scheduled cases, in a private meeting that he had arranged through the judge's clerk. Sheriff Graves was not present. Douglas Ruing was not present. Calvin Barnett sat across from the judge in the small room at the back of the Caldwell courthouse and laid out the evidence piece by piece: the fabricated witness testimony, the physical impossibility of the entry point, the statement from Clara Whitmore, the testimony of Tomas Reyes, the timeline of Fletcher's comment about the brooch predating its official identification. Judge Pembroke read everything twice. He asked 6 questions, all of them sharp and precise. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Deputy Barnett, you understand that bringing this to me rather than your supervising officer represents a significant departure from protocol." "Yes, sir," Calvin said. "You've done it anyway." "Yes, sir." Pembroke studied him. "Why?" Calvin was quiet for just a moment. "Because the woman being accused didn't do it," he said, "and the protocol in place was being used to obstruct the truth rather than find it." Pembroke was quiet again. Then he said, "I'm going to need Miss Atwood here this afternoon. I'm also going to need the 3 witnesses who came forward against her, and I'm going to need Tomas Reyes, and I'm going to need Fletcher Ruin." What followed was one of the most extraordinary afternoons of Mary Atwood's life. She had dressed that morning in her best dark blue dress, the one with the deep cuffs that she had made herself, because she had known this day was coming, and she had decided to meet it looking exactly like herself, and not like someone who had spent 3 months being afraid. She sat in the Caldwell courthouse before Judge Pembroke, and answered his questions with the same clear, direct manner that had made her shop customers either love her or find her unsettling. And she watched as the afternoon unfolded with the unstoppable forward movement of a truth that has been held back too long and is finally allowed to run. The 3 witnesses crumbled under Pembroke's questioning with astonishing speed. It became apparent within the first 10 minutes that they had been coached in their testimony, because they repeated phrases in identical language, which was the particular mistake that people make when they learn lines rather than remember events. Within an hour, 2 of them had admitted they had been paid $20 each by a man they described only as someone working for the Ruin family. The 3rd held out longer, but not long enough. Tomas Reyes gave his testimony steadily and without embellishment. Clara Whitmore's written statement was read into the record. The physical analysis of the impossible entry window was presented and stood unchallenged. Fletcher Ruin, brought in under Pembroke's authority, walked into that courtroom with the loose, comfortable arrogance of a man who has never been seriously held accountable for anything in his life, and sat down across from the judge, and began to understand over the course of the next 90 minutes that this particular afternoon was going to be different. He did not confess, but he didn't need to. The evidence assembled by Calvin Barnett was thorough enough that his silence was already a form of answer, and Pembroke had decades of experience reading exactly this kind of silence. By the end of the session, the judge had declared the investigation against Mary Atwood formally closed on grounds of insufficient and compromised evidence, had referred the matter of witness tampering to the district attorney in Amarillo, and had issued a formal recommendation for an investigation into the robbery itself to be conducted by a marshal rather than the local sheriff's office. He had also, in terms that were polite but unmistakable, suggested to Sheriff Eli Graves that his handling of the case had reflected poorly on the office, and that the district attorney would likely want to discuss his relationship with the Ruin family at some point in the near future. Graves had gone very white. Mary had walked out of that courthouse into the cold November air and stood on the steps and felt the particular quality of a terrible weight being lifted off a body that had become so accustomed to carrying it that the absence of it was its own kind of disorientation. Calvin was standing at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her with those gray eyes that were actually looking at what they appeared to be looking at, and she came down the steps and stood in front of him, and she said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." He nodded. "I have been alone for a long time," she said. "I chose it mostly, or I chose the circumstances that made it necessary, and I made my peace with it, and I was doing well with it. And then everything happened, and I thought I was completely alone, and it was the most frightening thing I have ever felt, not the accusation but the aloneness of it." She paused. "And you were there. And you did the thing that only happens in stories that women tell each other about men they wish existed. You just decided the truth mattered more than anything else, and you held my name out of the record, and you worked in the dark, and you told me all of it before you had any reason to expect anything from me." She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that except tell you that it means everything, everything, and that I would very much like to know you better if you're willing." He was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, the amount of time it takes a careful person to feel something fully before they respond to it. "I've been willing for a while," he said. She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, warm and slightly startled, and it felt like the first real laugh she had produced in 3 months. He smiled, and it was a full smile this time, no holding back, and it transformed his face in a way that she immediately wanted to study. The cold air of the Caldwell afternoon moved around them, and somewhere down the street a door slammed, and a horse made its opinion about something known, and all of it felt like the sound of the ordinary, complicated world reasserting itself, which was exactly what she wanted. They had their first supper together at the Caldwell dining house 2 evenings later, which was notable primarily because it was the first time Mary had sat in the dining house without being aware of the watching eyes of the town as a hostile force. The watching eyes were still there because they were always there, but the quality of the watching had changed overnight, as town opinion tends to do when a judge from Amarillo publicly states that someone is innocent and the witnesses against them have admitted to being paid. The cold shoulders were warming. The women who had stopped coming to her shop would trickle back over the following weeks, some of them with embarrassed apologies and some without. But either way, the isolation was ending, and what had been hostile curiosity was becoming simply curiosity. She told Calvin that evening, over beef stew and bread that was better than it had any right to be in a Texas panhandle town in 1878, about Austin, about the dry goods merchant she had worked for, and the particular shape of that period of her life. She told him about the earlier version of herself, the version that had been less careful and less certain, and that had made choices she could not fully defend with hindsight. She told him about the man in Austin who had made her a series of promises with great sincerity and kept none of them, and about the professional consequence that had followed when she had made a decision about her own safety that had crossed certain of that man's interests. She told him about her mother, who had given her the Bible that was now the most precious thing she owned, and about her father, who had been a difficult and sometimes frightening man, and from whom she had inherited both her stubbornness and her capacity for silence under pressure. He listened to all of it. He told her about himself, which took less time because he was a more straightforward story. He had grown up in Missouri, had come west at 22 to find work, and found it in the only capacity that seemed to be hiring in Kansas and Texas in the 1870s, which was law enforcement. He was good at it in the particular way that quiet, observant people are good at it. He had never been ambitious about it. He had stayed because staying was easier than leaving and because the work itself, when it was done honestly, mattered to him in a way he found difficult to articulate but had never managed to talk himself out of. He told her about a fire in a town in Kansas, 4 years back, that had killed 2 people, and that he had been too slow to prevent, and about the particular way that kind of thing alters a person's relationship with urgency and action. About the discipline he had developed in its wake, not slowness for its own sake, but the deliberate management of impulse in the service of accuracy. Because, in his experience, it was impulsive action that created most of the disasters he spent his working life sorting through. She thought about him carrying her name out of those official reports week after week, quietly, alone, without anyone knowing, and thought that this was exactly what the discipline of accurate, patient, non-impulsive action looked like when applied to something that mattered. The supper lasted 2 hours, and when it ended she was aware, walking back to her rooms above the hardware store, of a sensation she identified after a moment as happiness. Not the relief of the courthouse afternoon, not the temporary warmth of safety after danger, but a genuine, grounded, forward-looking happiness of the kind that has a tomorrow implied in it. The investigation that Judge Pembroke had commissioned proceeded through the winter and into the early spring of 1879. A federal marshal named James Cooley was assigned to the ruin robbery case, and he was an extremely different creature from Sheriff Graves, being primarily interested in facts and entirely uninterested in politics. By February, it had been established beyond serious doubt that Fletcher Ruane had robbed his own father's safe in order to create a crisis that could be directed at Mary Atwood. The motive, which Cooley uncovered through a thorough examination of Fletcher's private financial situation, was that Fletcher had significant gambling debts that he could not pay without his father's money, and that engineering a robbery for which someone else could be blamed allowed him to resolve both problems simultaneously: the debt and the woman who had refused him. It was, in Marshall Cooley's dry assessment, a plan of remarkable pettiness and considerable danger, which was entirely consistent with what everyone who had taken the time to look carefully at Fletcher Ruane had discovered about his character. Fletcher was arrested in March. His father, to the surprise of many and the surprise of nobody, was devastated, not precisely by his son's criminality, but by the public exposure of it. And Douglas Ruane spent the spring of 1879 in a kind of private collapse of authority that had significant effects on the Caldwell political landscape. Sheriff Graves resigned his position in February, before the full weight of Cooley's investigation landed on him, which was the calculation of a man who had lived long enough in that particular world to know when to step off a ship. The question of who would take over as sheriff fell, with the inevitability of things that are obvious in retrospect, on Calvin Barnett. He was offered the position by the county commissioner in late February, while the winter was still holding on with its cold, dry grip. He told Mary about it that evening, sitting in her shop as he had begun to do 3 or 4 evenings a week, the two of them occupying the warm, lamplit space with the comfortable ease of people who have discovered in each other a quality of company that makes the ordinary hours of the day more valuable. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I think I should take it," he said. "The town needs someone who isn't compromised." "And you're not compromised," she said. "I'm about as uncompromised as a person gets," he said, with the faint, dry humor that she had come to treasure as one of his most specific qualities. She smiled. "Then you should take it." He looked at her. Something in his expression had a different quality that evening, a kind of gathering, as though he were pulling something together internally in preparation for saying it. "I'd like to take it," he said, "if we're going to stay here, which depends on a conversation I've been trying to find the right time to have." She was very still. "I want to marry you," he said, with the same plain directness that he applied to everything, the same absence of performance. "I want to ask you properly, with the ring and everything, but I wanted to know first whether that's something you'd want before I did it, because I didn't want to put you in a position of refusing publicly if you didn't want it, and I didn't want to ambush you with a question that large." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the shop window, Caldwell was dark and quiet, the winter street empty, the lamplight making the cold glass glow amber. "Calvin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have spent most of my adult life being very, very careful about exactly this kind of thing," she said. "I know," he said. "I have had excellent reasons to be careful," she said. "You have," he said. "And I want you to know that what I'm about to say is not carelessness," she said. "It's the opposite of carelessness. It's the most clear-eyed, deliberate, fully considered answer I've ever given to any question in my life." He waited. "Yes," she said. He exhaled slowly. She watched the tension that had been very subtly holding his whole body together for the last several minutes release itself. And his smile came in full, the real one, the one that changed everything about his face. And she thought, with the quiet certainty that good decisions produce, that she was going to be looking at that smile for a very long time, and that this was an extraordinarily good thing. He did ask her properly afterward, with a ring he had already purchased from the jeweler in Amarillo on a trip that he had apparently made for exactly this purpose, which told her that the question of timing had been the only remaining variable. The ring was a simple gold band with a small sapphire in a clean setting, the kind of ring a careful, honest man with modest means chooses for a woman he actually knows, not for the woman he is performing devotion for. She held her hand still while he put it on and felt, along with everything else, an enormous gratitude for the specific, uncomplicated rightness of it. They were married in the spring, on a Thursday in April 1879, in the small white-painted church at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street. The Reverend was a man named Thomas Ellery, who had been kind to Mary throughout the difficult winter, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that the occasion deserved. The church was fuller than either of them had expected, which reflected the speed with which Caldwell's opinion had completed its reversal. But Mary was not focused on the church or its occupants. She was focused on the man standing at the front of it, who was looking at her with the particular quality of sustained attention that she had first identified as his defining characteristic, and had come to understand, over the months that had passed, as something more specific than attention. It was devotion of a very quiet and very durable kind, the kind that does not require an audience. She walked the aisle alone, because there was no one to walk it with her, and she felt the aloneness of it for exactly one moment before she understood that this was the last time in her life she would walk anywhere alone in the sense that had once been her constant, familiar companion. Something was ending in the most welcome possible way. Calvin took her hand at the front of the church, and the Reverend began to speak, and outside the April sun was doing something generous with the light, throwing it through the high windows in long, warm columns that landed on the old wooden floor and moved very slowly as the ceremony progressed. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and meant every word of them with a specificity and a depth that she had not known she was capable of. He said his in the quiet, precise tone that was his natural register, looking at her with those gray eyes that held everything and showed it all, and she thought that she had been wrong about him when she first read him as background. He was not background. He had never been background. He had simply been waiting for the context in which she could see him clearly. Caldwell grew and changed around them in the years that followed, as frontier towns do, lurching between periods of ordinary industry and occasional drama, settling gradually into something that resembled permanence. Calvin took his position as sheriff with the same measured seriousness he brought to everything, and the office functioned under him with a steadiness and a fairness that people noticed and valued without always finding the words to articulate. He was not the most dramatic sheriff the county had ever seen. He was simply the most trustworthy, which turned out to matter far more. Mary's shop became one of the most reliable businesses on the main street. She was good at what she did, and she was honest about it, and the combination built the kind of reputation that sustains a business through difficult seasons. She hired a girl named Patience Lowe as an assistant in the summer of 1879, and then a second girl named Rachel Sims the following year, and the shop expanded from the original small room into the adjacent space when the cobbler next door moved to a larger location down the street. She and Calvin lived first in the rooms above the hardware store, which had always been hers, and then moved in the autumn of 1879 into a small house 2 streets over from the main street, a white-painted house with a porch that faced east, which meant morning sun and evening shade, which was exactly backward from the houses that faced west, but which Mary had decided she preferred because she was a morning person and wanted the light when she was awake to enjoy it. Calvin had agreed without discussion, because he had the particular virtue of caring about the things that mattered and not particularly caring about the things that didn't. Their first child was born in June of 1880, a boy they named James, after Marshal James Cooley, which felt like the right kind of acknowledgement. He was a serious, large-eyed baby who developed into a serious, large-eyed small boy with his father's quality of attention and his mother's directness, and both of them found this combination entirely delightful. The winter of 1880 brought a new challenge. A series of stage robberies along the Caldwell to Amarillo route had been troubling the county for months, and the gang responsible had proved elusive in ways that suggested local knowledge, local cover, or both. Calvin worked the investigation with his characteristic patience, not rushing toward easy answers, building a picture from accumulating evidence the way he had built the case against Fletcher Ruin 2 years earlier. Mary was not uninvolved. She was not the kind of person who could be uninvolved in things that mattered to the people around her, and after the particular education of her own crisis, she had developed a finely calibrated eye for hidden motives and planted evidence and the specific ways in which lies work in the grain of ordinary truth. She noticed things. She told Calvin about them. He listened with the full attention he brought to everything she said, and took the information seriously, without making her feel that her observations were either more or less than what they were. It was Mary who noticed, in December of 1880, that one of the stage drivers, a man named Arlen Potts who had been with the Caldwell Stage Company for 3 years, was spending more money than his wages accounted for. She noticed this not through any official capacity, but simply through the ordinary mechanisms of small-town observation: a new coat, a new saddle visible outside the saloon, a conversation about land purchases she had overheard in the shop when Arlen's wife came in for alterations. She mentioned it to Calvin that evening without emphasis, simply as information, the way she always brought him things she had noticed. He looked at her for a long moment. "His wife came in today," he said. "For the second time in 3 weeks," Mary said. "First time she had a new summer dress altered. Today it was a winter coat that was too long in the sleeve. Both pieces were new and both were expensive, more than a stage driver's family buys in November." Calvin was quiet. "Arlen Potts," he said. "I'm not accusing him of anything," she said carefully. "I know," he said, "but you're noticing the same thing you noticed about your own situation. The money that doesn't fit." She nodded. Arlen Potts turned out to be the inside man for the robbery gang, providing route schedules and passenger information to a 3-man operation run out of a ranch property 12 miles east of Caldwell. Calvin arrested all 4 of them in January 1881 with the assistance of the federal marshal's office, the kind of clean, evidence-based resolution that doesn't make for exciting stories but makes for sound justice. After the arrests, when the paperwork was finished and the evening had settled into the quiet domesticity that had become the best part of their daily life, Mary looked at Calvin across the supper table, where James was making the particular serious study of his food that he applied to most things. "You know," she said, "the first time you came to my shop and asked about the brooch, I couldn't decide whether you were helping me or whether it was a different kind of trap." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I could tell." "What did that feel like?" she asked. He thought about it. "Like watching someone decide whether a bridge is sound enough to cross," he said. "I just had to show you it would hold." She smiled. "You did." James chose this moment to announce, with considerable conviction, that he did not want to eat the rest of his carrots, and both of them redirected their attention to the negotiation this required, and the tender moment dissolved into the ordinary comedy of family life, which was its own form of happiness, less dramatic but more durable than the acute kind. The spring of 1881 brought a letter that Mary had not expected. It was from Clara Whitmore, the schoolteacher from Abilene whose written statement had been so important to the Judge Pembroke hearing 2 years before. Clara had married and moved to a town in New Mexico Territory, and was doing well, and she had written to Mary because she had heard through some chain of correspondence about Mary's marriage to the deputy who had investigated her case. She wrote that she had thought of Mary often and had been glad to hear that things had resolved well, and she enclosed a small pressed flower from her new garden as a gesture that was perhaps more sentimental than practical, but seemed genuine for all of that. Mary read the letter twice and then wrote back, a long letter, longer than she had written to anyone in some time, about Caldwell and the shop and James and Calvin, and the particular quality of the life she had built in this place that had once been so hostile and had become, through a series of events that still sometimes struck her as extraordinary, genuinely home. She told Clara about the day in the courthouse and the judge's ruling, and the way Calvin had been standing at the bottom of the steps. She told her about the reports, the weekly reports that left her name out, that she hadn't known about until the afternoon he told her in the sheriff's office. The afternoon she had gone in to pick up a piece of property the county had been holding that now belonged to her, and he had looked at her across the scarred desk and said it so quietly she almost thought she had imagined it. She told Clara that she had thought about those reports, more than once since. About what it meant that someone had decided so early and so firmly that she was telling the truth, and had organized their actions around that belief without demanding anything in return, without even needing her to know about it. She had thought about the gap between that and the kind of support that comes with conditions, with expectations, with the implicit billing that most help arrives with. She had thought about what it meant that his first instinct had been to protect her from permanent record, from the official documentation of something untrue. She had decided that it said something fundamental about the kind of person he was, something that had proven itself out in 2 years of shared life in the ways that character always reveals itself, through the accumulated evidence of ordinary days. In September of 1881, their second child arrived, a girl this time, whom they named Eliza, after Mary's mother. She was a round, emphatic baby with Calvin's gray eyes and a voice that was already clearly planning to be heard. James received her with the benevolent tolerance of a 2-year-old who has decided to be generous, and the house, already warm, became warmer. Calvin came home to it every evening with the specific quality of a man who knows what he has and values it accurately, which is rarer than it should be, and which Mary had come to appreciate with an intensity that still occasionally surprised her. She had not known, before this, that the ordinary texture of a shared life could be this rich. She had expected, if she was honest, that the dramatic arc would be the part that mattered, the accusation and the exoneration and the falling in love and the marriage, and that afterward would be merely the afterward. She had been comprehensively wrong about this. The afterward was the point. The afterward was where everything actually lived. There were difficult things. There was the summer of 1882, when a fever went through Caldwell and both children were ill for 2 terrible weeks, and Mary and Calvin barely slept. There was a confrontation in the spring of 1883 when a man with a grudge against Calvin came to the house rather than the sheriff's office, which was a tactic for intimidation, and Mary, who was alone when he arrived, had handled it with a composure that surprised the man considerably, and that she privately credited to the fact that she had survived worse, and the man, for all his apparent menace, was simply a frightened person making a bad choice. There was the winter of 1883 to 1884 that was extremely cold even by Texas standards, and that created hardship throughout the county and tested everyone's patience and generosity. Through all of it, the fundamental thing held. They were honest with each other. They looked at each other with clear eyes and said the true things and did the true things and found, as people do when they build on a foundation of actual honesty, that the structure holds. By 1884, Caldwell had grown considerably from the town Mary had arrived in 7 years before. The railway had come through the region, which changed everything about the economics and the demographics, bringing new people and new commerce and a faster pace that was exciting to some and unsettling to others. Mary's shop had grown again, adding a 3rd room for the embroidery and custom work that had become her specialty, and she had become an institution on the main street in the particular way that businesses built by people who genuinely care about what they do become institutions. Calvin had been re-elected sheriff twice by now, each time with the kind of margin that reflects genuine trust rather than political maneuvering. He was known throughout the county as the sort of official who could be approached by anyone with a legitimate complaint and expected to receive a fair hearing, and this reputation had slowly eroded the inherited culture of the Graves years, in which certain people were protected and others were exposed. It was patient, structural work, the kind of work that rarely generates stories but generates communities, and he did it with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. The spring of 1884 brought a development that neither of them had anticipated: a newspaper. The Caldwell Courier had been operating as a single-sheet weekly for several years, but in April of 1884 it was purchased by a man named William Hatch from St. Louis, who had ideas about what a western town newspaper could be and the capital to pursue them. Hatch was young, perhaps 25, energetic, and possessed of the journalist's fundamental conviction that everything important should be known and nothing important should be hidden, which was a philosophy that Mary found immediately sympathetic and that Calvin regarded with a measured mixture of appreciation and caution. Hatch's first major story was about the Ruin case of 1878, which he had apparently researched thoroughly through court records and interviews. He came to Mary and Calvin separately and asked for their accounts, and both of them gave it, because the story was true and documented, and the truth of it no longer had the power to harm anyone who deserved protection. The story Hatch published ran over 2 issues of the Courier and was the most widely read thing the paper had published. It described the false accusation and the official investigation that had been conducted in bad faith and the secret counter-investigation by a deputy who had believed the accused woman from the beginning. It described the Pembroke hearing and the collapse of the witness testimony and the eventual arrest of Fletcher Ruin. It described, in one paragraph, the personal outcome for the 2 central figures in the story. Mary read it at the supper table while Calvin read it over her shoulder, and the children were asleep and the house was quiet. "He got it right," she said when she finished. "Most of it," Calvin said. "What did he get wrong?" He pointed to a paragraph toward the end. Hatch had written that the deputy's decision to conduct a secret investigation reflected a heroism of considerable magnitude. "Heroism is the wrong word," Calvin said. "It makes it sound like it was hard." "It wasn't hard, it was just obvious." She turned to look at him. He was standing behind her chair and she had to tilt her head back to see his face properly from this angle, and she held it there, looking at him from below in the lamplight. "It wasn't obvious to anyone else," she said. "Then they weren't paying attention," he said. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on the back of her chair. He turned his hand over and held hers. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," she said affectionately. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said. "That's why it works," she said. "Probably," he said. By the summer of 1884, with James 4 years old and Eliza 3, Mary was expecting again, and the house, pleasant as it was beginning to feel the pressure of a family that was finding its existing space slightly inadequate. Calvin spent 3 Saturdays in June and July walking through properties with a measuring step, and a particular expression she had come to associate with his decision-making process, the expression of a man examining the load-bearing capacity of each option before committing. He found a house on the eastern edge of town, a larger house with 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and a back garden that caught the afternoon light in a way that made Mary, when he brought her to see it, stop in the doorway of the kitchen and just breathe for a moment. "This is it," she said. "I thought you'd think so," he said. They moved in August. The baby arrived in October, another boy, whom they named Robert, and who from his first hours had the cheerful, loud, undiscriminating friendliness of a person who is going to be easy to love and easy to worry about in equal measure. The life they had built settled around them with the satisfying weight of something genuinely constructed. Mary thought sometimes, in the particular stillness of late evenings when the children were asleep and Calvin was reading beside her, and the house was making its familiar small sounds, about the morning she had first walked into the sheriff's office under suspicion, rigid with fear and determination in equal measure. She thought about the weeks of isolation and the way the town had withdrawn from her, which had felt like dying by very slow degrees. She thought about the 5-minute practice, the fear given its time, and then the standing up. She thought about a quiet man with his hat in his hands who had decided, from the very beginning, that she was telling the truth. She had asked him once in the early months of their marriage why he had been so certain. Why, given no particular evidence in her favor and the initial appearance of a case against her, he had been so sure. He had thought about it for a while. "The evidence against you was too clean," he said. "Real evidence is messy. It has gaps and contradictions and things that don't make sense yet. The evidence against you was a perfect story, and perfect stories don't happen. They're made." She had looked at him. "Also," he had said, after a pause that contained something he was deciding whether to include, "the way you answered my questions. You didn't shape your answers toward any particular conclusion. People who are lying try to be helpful in a directed way. You were just trying to be accurate." "You could tell that," she said. "By then, yes," he said. "I've been asking questions long enough to hear the difference." She had thought about this afterward, about the specific skill of recognizing truth when it presents itself plainly, without performance, without direction. About how rare that skill was, and how much it cost when it wasn't present in the people who had power over your life. About how much she had been given, ultimately, by its presence in this one particular man. There were evenings that fall, with Robert new and fretful and James, and Eliza navigating the complicated politics of shared space with the vigor that children bring to all negotiations, when the house was full of noise and motion, and every surface seemed occupied by some small, urgent need, and Calvin would come home through the back door from an entirely different category of noise and motion, and the two worlds would briefly collide in the kitchen with something approaching chaos. And he would stand in the middle of it, in his coat and his badge and his hat, and he would look at her across the scene, through the noise and the motion and the organized disorder of the life they had made, and she would look back. And in that look was everything. Everything that had passed between them, everything that had been built, everything that had been risked and survived and resolved and chosen. The fear and the accusation and the cold January days and the courthouse afternoon and the bottom of those steps and the ring from Amarillo and the shop on the main street and the house facing east and the two serious children and the cheerful loud baby and the 6 years of accumulated ordinary extraordinary daily life. In the early spring of 1885, Mary received a visitor she had not expected. Douglas Ruin came into her shop on a Tuesday morning, alone, without announcement, and stood in the doorway for a moment as though deciding whether to proceed. He was older than she remembered, the events of 1879 having taken something permanent from him that showed in his face, but he was still a large, self-possessed man, and he met her eyes without difficulty. She waited. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I have owed you one for 6 years." She had not planned for this. She had thought occasionally about what Douglas Ruin's acknowledgment would mean if it ever came, but she had not expected it and she was not fully prepared. She held herself steady. "I believed what I was told," he said, "about you. I had no reason to question it at the time, and I told myself for a long time that that was sufficient justification. I know now that it isn't." Paused. "My son caused a harm against you that he has not answered for adequately, and I cannot remedy that. What I can do is tell you as directly as I am capable of telling you that I am sorry for my part in what was done to you." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Ruin," she said finally, "I spent 9 months carrying the weight of what happened to me, and your family's name was a significant part of that weight. I won't pretend otherwise." She paused. "I also know that you've lost things in this. I know that your son is not the man you believed him to be. I'm sorry for that, genuinely." He looked at her with an expression she had not expected on his face, which was simple, uncomplicated relief. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. He left. She stood in her shop for a moment after the door closed, taking account of what had just happened. Patience Lowe appeared from the back room with the expression of someone who has very carefully not been eavesdropping. "Are you all right?" Patience asked. "Yes," Mary said. She thought about it more carefully. "Yes, I actually am." She told Calvin about it that evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the April light with Robert in his lap, and the sound of James and Eliza's game audible through the window. He listened without interrupting. "That took courage," he said when she finished. "His or mine?" Both, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He shifted Robert to his other arm to accommodate her, and they sat in the quiet evening and watched the last of the light leave the sky in stages, the vivid orange first, and then the softer pink, and then the deep blue that came in from the east and moved over everything. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what we teach James and Eliza and Robert," she said, "when they're old enough to understand what happened, about what story we tell them about this place and how we got here." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to tell them?" "The true one," she said, "with all the parts in it, including the parts that were hard. I want them to know that things can be very wrong and still get right again. I want them to know what it looks like when someone decides to do the correct thing even when it's costly. I want them to know their father did that." His arm around her shoulders tightened slightly. "I want them to know their mother stood up under something that would have flattened most people," he said. "I want them to know that's where they come from." The evening deepened around them. Down the street, a lamp came on in a window. Robert made a small, contented sound and settled more firmly into his father's arm. Inside, the sound of James and Eliza's game had shifted into something quieter, the particular muted domestic music of children winding down toward bedtime. Mary thought about beginnings and about how the beginning of this life had been the worst thing that had happened to her since her mother died, and how from that worst thing something extraordinary had grown, and how that growth did not make the worst thing acceptable or justified or good, but it did make it true that sometimes the place where a person is broken open is exactly where the light gets in. She thought about a stack of weekly reports in an official file in a sheriff's office, every one of them complete and honest and accurate, except for the one name they did not contain. She thought about the particular care that required, the discipline of week after week of omission, the sustained, quiet, costly act of holding her name out of the permanent record. She thought about him saying it so softly she almost missed it. "Every report I filed left your name out because I believed you from the start." She had found the words for it now, the words she had told him she didn't have yet on the courthouse steps 6 years ago. She had found them gradually, through the accumulation of days that proved them out. What he had done, and what he had continued to do in every quiet and deliberate way of his life, was see her. Not the version of her that the town had decided she was. Not the dangerous category she represented to people who found independent women troubling. Not the suspect or the accused or the woman who had refused the wrong man's proposal. He had seen Mary Atwood, and he had decided from the very beginning that she was telling the truth, and he had arranged everything he did around that decision with the steadiness and patience and absolute fidelity that were, she now understood, simply the natural expression of his character. It was not heroism, as he had said. It was not extraordinary. It was just him being entirely what he was. But it had saved her life as surely as if he had pulled her from a burning building, and she loved him for it with the particular depth that comes from being known fully and found to be enough. The night came down over Caldwell, Texas in the spring of 1885, soft and dark and full of ordinary stars, and on the porch of the house that faced east, a woman who had been alone and afraid and accused and cleared and married and built a life held on to the man beside her and felt, in every particular and in the fullest possible sense of the word, at home. Calvin turned his head and pressed his lips to the top of her hair, the way he had done 1,000 times before, unremarkably, as naturally as breathing. "James has been asking about the badge again," he said. "He wants to know if he can try it on." She laughed softly. "Let him try it on. I thought you'd say that." "He's going to want to be exactly like you," she said. "Heaven help him," Calvin said. "Heaven help everyone," she said. They stayed on the porch until the stars were thick overhead, and the spring air turned just cool enough to make the warmth between them feel deliberate, and then went inside to their children and their home, and the ongoing, daily, magnificent, ordinary work of the life they had chosen for each other. In 1887, a fourth child arrived, a girl they named Ruth, and the house, which had seemed adequately large in 1884, became gloriously full. James at 7 was already showing the particular quality of patient observation that his father had, which Mary found both deeply familiar and faintly comic, watching it emerge in a child's face. Eliza at 6 was outspoken and decisive, in a way that Calvin met with perfect equanimity, and that Mary recognized with a private humor as the particular flavor of her own temperament arriving in the next generation. Robert at 3 was conducting an enthusiastic investigation of the physical world that required constant gentle redirection, and was going to grow into a person of tremendous energy and curiosity. Ruth was simply Ruth, a new specific person, occupying her particular place in the family's constellation with the serene authority of all newcomers who do not yet know they are newcomers. Calvin was 40 that year. He had threads of gray at his temples and a particular quality of settled ease in his face that had replaced the careful watchfulness of his younger years, or rather had settled over it like a second layer, so that the watchfulness was still there, but worn more lightly, the way a coat is worn more easily once it has shaped itself to the body that lives in it. He still held his hat in his hands when he spoke to people. He still had the quality of actual presence in the rooms he occupied. He was still the kind of person who noticed the one thing that didn't fit and cared enough about it to understand why. Mary was 35. She was running one of the most successful businesses in Caldwell, had trained 3 women who now worked for her with genuine skill, had expanded her custom embroidery into orders from as far as Amarillo, and was regarded in the community with the particular respect that goes to people who have demonstrated over time that their word is good in every possible weather. She was also, in the private accounting of her own life, happy in a way that she had once not quite believed was available to her, a happiness that was not performed or forced but simply present, like the east-facing light in the morning. She had kept the Bible her mother gave her on the shelf above her work table in the shop, where she could see it while she worked. She had kept the ring from Amarillo on her left hand for 8 years now, the gold worn to a comfortable softness, the sapphire still precisely itself. She had kept every letter from Clara Whitmore in a cedar box in the bedroom, and they exchanged letters 4 times a year as regularly as seasons, documenting the progress of 2 lives that had been briefly connected by a shared injustice and had gone on, each in its own direction, to become something whole and good. One September evening in 1887, the exact 9-year anniversary of the first meeting between Mary Atwood and Sheriff Graves in the questioning room, Calvin came home to find Mary sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and a book, and the particular expression of someone who has just finished a thought that pleased them. "What?" he said, sitting beside her. "I was just calculating," she said. "What were you calculating?" "How many reports you filed," she said. "From September 1878 until the Pembroke hearing in November, that's about 10 weeks if you were filing weekly." He considered this. 10 or 11, he said. 10 or 11 reports, she said, with my name removed from all of them. "Yes," he said. "That was a lot of careful work," she said. "It wasn't much," he said. "It was just leaving a name out." "It was never just leaving a name out," she said. "You know that." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the evening street with its quiet traffic of horses and people and the distant sound of the courier's printing press working late on tomorrow's edition. "I know that," he said. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on his knee and held it. "Thank you," she said, which was what she had said to him on the front step of her shop 9 years ago, inadequately before she had the words for it. "You have always been thanking me for that," he said. "You don't owe me any more thanks. You never owed me anything." "I know I don't owe it," she said. "That's not why I'm saying it." He looked at her. "I'm saying it because it was the kindest thing anyone ever did for me," she said. "And I want to keep saying it for the rest of my life so you never forget that I know it. And so I never forget what it felt like to find out." He was quiet for a long time in the way that meant he was feeling something fully before he responded to it. Then he turned her hand over and held it properly, her fingers in his palm, and said, "All right." The evening moved over Caldwell in its usual fashion, the light going down by stages, the stars emerging one by one into a sky that was very deep and very clear. Somewhere in the house behind them, the children were negotiating something that would require parental intervention within approximately 3 minutes, and they both knew it, and they sat on the porch in the warm interval before that moment and held on. Everything had been survived. Everything that needed to be built had been built. The trap had failed. The dark past had been accounted for. The hidden motive had been exposed. The forbidden truth had come into the open and stood in the light without flinching. The secrets had been told, and the betrayal had been answered, and the forced choice had been made, and the ultimate sacrifice had been offered, and, in the particular grace that sometimes attends human endeavors, had not in the end been required. What remained was this: the porch and the evening and the children inside, and the work that waited in the morning and the years that were still coming. Years that would hold their own difficulties and their own revelations and their own ordinary and extraordinary moments, all of them to be met in the same way every other thing had been met. Together, clearly, with honesty, with the patient and unwavering faith that two people can place in each other when they have made the decision, fully and with clear eyes, to do so. Mary Atwood, who was now Mary Barnett in the daily practice of her life, though she signed her professional work with both names, held her husband's hand on the porch of their house, and felt the particular weight of everything that had been and everything that was and everything that would be, all of it real, all of it hers. Inside, a child's voice rose to the pitch that indicated the intervention moment had arrived. She and Calvin both stood at the same moment, which was so predictable that it made her laugh. He opened the door. The house received them back.